So here in the US, an election is coming up, and every time an election does come up, there becomes a revitalized interest in the inner workings of politics. How does the Electoral College work? How does voting work? Where did it come from? But one of the things that's not often done is really digging into the political foundations of Western democracy. Where do we get our ideas from of things like equal rights, for example, or equality under the law and rule by law, right? That there's not something above law, but that law itself is supreme and should apply equally to all citizens. Now, this is toyed with in Plato and Aristotle, for example, but the kind of notion you get of equality there is very different from the kind of equality that we have today. For example, Aristotle says that equality is treating equals as equals and unequals as unequals. And he uses this as an argument for slavery, because slaves are not equal in their natural capacities, and thus their treatment should be tailored to their subordinate natural capacities. Now we get a very different image in Cicero's Republic and Laws. Cicero is one of the founding theorists for natural law, natural rights, and the rule of law. And as such, I think it's important that we delve into this kind of theory to see, okay, well, what is the importance placed on things like reason, rational deliberation, virtue, modesty, things like this, because they play a very big part in how we consider ourselves as political animals, because Aristotle says that man is by nature a political animal. Marx says by extension that we are also social animals, right? And thus economic animals as well. So it's important that we can kind of dig into these categories and negotiate them properly. Now, a lot of these early political scientists, if we can call them that, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Aquinas, etc., are trying to struggle with how should the state be constituted? Who should rule it? How should decisions be made? And Cicero is struggling with deciding between three different kinds of political regimes, that being a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. Now, a monarchy is going to be ruled by a king, a singular ruler who is going to have primary or exclusive political authority. And of course, with monarchy, there are all kinds of arguments that are made today about the usefulness of monarchy. It's simple. If you have a good monarch, then it's great. But of course, the problem is the tenuous nature of monarchy, which can quickly turn into tyranny. This is especially important considering the dismantling of the U.S. government planned in Project 2025. And thus we can see that, even if you think Trump is a fantastic guy, what's to say he won't become more of a tyrant than he already is if his executive power is expanded even more. And this is something that Cicero is struggling with. He says, okay, monarchies is not the best because political regimes are going to go through these cyclical means by which, for example, we get a nice ruler that everyone wants, he turns tyrannical, people depose him, and then we either get an aristocracy or democracy, and we get the rule of virtue for a while because everyone's living off that political high. And then we sink into anarchy, confusion, chaos, a need to reestablish these political boundaries, and we open up a space for tyranny. And this just happens cyclically for Cicero. But he's trying to figure out some way in which we can have the good parts of a monarchy, but also the good parts of the aristocracy, which is that ideally these people will have some merit, so it will be something like a meritocracy, and they will rule and they will have a bit of multiplicity to them, but they won't just be mob rule. And then also you have, the great things about democracy, which is freedom and equality and whatnot. But of course, Cicero wants to kind of put an asterisk on democracy and freedom, because for him, everything is best achieved as a mean. Just like Aristotle, any of the extremes are going to lead to tyranny, coercion, pain, strife, struggle, etc. So he wants to find a golden mean between these three political regimes. And he says, okay, since then law is the bound which holds together a community of citizens, and the justice embodied in the law is the same for everyone, right? We're all held to the same standards because the law is the law. By what right can a community of citizens be held together when their status is unequal? Right? We have different aspirations, different means of achieving those aspirations, different natural abilities and whatnot. And he says, if the equalization of wealth is rejected, as in we're not just going to give everyone the same outcomes, and the equalization of everybody's abilities is impossible, because we're just naturally bestowed with different abilities, nothing we can do to change that. Legal rights, at least, must be equal among those who live as fellow citizens in the same state. For what is a state other than an equal partnership in justice? And this is a very progressive move compared to Plato and Aristotle, where we have equality of rights regardless of your level of superiority within your society, because politics, and thus your partnership in the state, is an equal partnership in justice. And I want to return to this at the end once we've gone through some of the other parts of the Republic and the laws. But note here that equal rights are something that's accepted within his political order. But one of the things that he's struggling with is, okay, how do we unite this? How do we create a unitary order out of these relatively disparate, different regimes of power? Monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy are qualitatively different in the way that they go about ruling their citizens. And he says, okay, if there is to be a ruling power in the human mind, which is going to be used to construct society, it will be the sovereignty of a single element, namely reason. For that is the best part of the mind. And as long as reason is supreme, there is no room for lust, anger, or irresponsible behavior. And as with a lot of these figures, there's a centrality placed on virtue, that being a virtuous citizen is necessary to the maintenance of a political order, because, as Aristotle says, a city is by nature a multitude. It is a multitude of people, and it is not, as Plato said, best exemplified when it is most similar to a single individual. A city thrives on multiplicity. That's how it expands and changes and burgeons and lives and whatnot. If it was just reduced to a single person, it would be a single person. It would no longer be a city, per Aristotle. And Cicero says, well, if we want to maintain this virtue, it needs to be based in reason, because reason will allow us to deliberate concerning what nature has given us, and nature is a very important part of Cicero. And by doing so, we avoid lust, which is wanting what we can't and by nature shouldn't have, or anger, which is being perturbed by what we ought not be perturbed at, or irresponsible behavior, which is, extending our actions into domains that it doesn't belong at this particular moment. So all of this is serving to unite the political order under some common deliberative agency. But Cicero does still have a soft spot for monarchy, for the unitary rule of one person in an emergency situation. And this is one of the telltale signs of Roman political theory, is dictatorship, right? All the Caesar, right, Marcus Aurelius, these were all kind of dictators in certain senses. And for him, in times of wartime, we need an emergency dictator. And this is very similar to the rhetoric that's currently going on with Trump, where we have this invading liberal agenda and we need to rein it in through, I even hear talk about blasphemy laws coming back, but also think of like the book bannings that have been happening around the US, especially in the South and in particular in Florida. All of this is kind of a re-encroachment of this dictatorial approach where in emergency times, these call for emergency measures by which most of the individual rights go away because, as he says, the people will say to the dictator, "You brought us forth into the realms of light." The dictator will be a savior. He says, in times of more serious conflict, our countrymen have decreed that the supreme power should not be shared, even with one colleague, but should rest in the hands of an individual whose very name reflects the nature of his power. So in emergency situations, he says, okay, we need someone super powerful, and that means we need to just accept what nature has given, which is that there's some guy who is endowed with so much power that he just deserves it. And this negotiation of power is difficult because you think about the way this plays out in democracy too. This is one of the things that Plato is very worried about democracy doing, is it turns into mob rule, because it's one of the well-known facts and kind of asterisks regarding democracy is that majority rule means minority coercion, right? If you've got a decision and 51% of the populace chooses one way and 49% the other, 100% of the population becomes, subject to just over half of the populace's decisions. And as such, 49% is coerced into doing something they didn't want to. Now, of course, the typical response is that, well, in democracy, in a society of a multitude, you do things that you don't want to, and majority rule is just a good heuristic. But Cicero wants to wonder, okay, what's going to happen if this goes to the utmost extreme? What happens if the majority rule is going to entail something of such license that it threatens democracy itself? Which is quite funny considering, for example, it wasn't a majority, by far it wasn't a majority, but the Capitol rioters who broke into the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. This is a democratic action of sorts. It's people expressing their individual political agency as a unit upset with the current state of affairs. But it fundamentally undermines our democratic principles, such as the certification of elections in accordance with the popular vote, right? So Cicero says, okay, this excessive license, which the anarchists, which he almost calls these excessive Democrats, these people who champion freedom above all else, as anarchists. This excessive license, which they think is the only true freedom, provides the stock, as it were, from which a tyrant grows. As the death of an aristocracy comes from its own excessive power, so freedom itself plunges an over-free populace into slavery. All excess, whether the over-luxuriance has occurred in the weather or on the land or in the people's bodies, turns as a rule into its opposite. In communities and individuals alike, excessive freedom topples over into excessive slavery. So, right, we don't want total freedom. We don't want the total whims of the citizens because most people don't base their decisions on, solid political axioms. They go by whatever floats my boat at the time. This is why whenever a U.S. Debate comes up regarding the presidency and, Trump or Hillary come up or Trump or Harris come up, what's the first thing that they get asked about? The economy, because the economy affects people the most. That's the kind of thing that motivates most people's political decisions. Not what is most politically rational, per se, but what suits their ends. So as such, we want the license granted by freedom to do what suits my individual means, but not what reaches beyond my individual means and sullies the means and goals of others. And as such, we're seeing the birth of rights-based ethics, the beginning of libertarianism. But it's still firmly based in a virtue-based approach, based on reason. And as such, he wants to offer us a mixed constitution where we're combining, once again, those three regimes I discussed, that being the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. And he says, okay, monarchy itself is surpassed by an even and judicious blend of these three simple forms at their best. So once again, we're finding a golden mean. A state, he says, should possess an element of regal supremacy. Something else should be assigned and allotted to the authority of aristocrats, and certain affairs should be reserved for the judgment and desires of the masses. Such a constitution has, in the first place, a widespread element of equality, which free men cannot long do without. Right? You have the ability of people to live most of their lives according as their goals suggest, but nevertheless there are certain fetters such that every action, every moment of deliberation within this political constitution has its own limits. Thus, this insistence on the deliberation of the reasoned mind in accordance with nature leads Cicero to the founding of natural law, one of the most important concepts for understanding contemporary Western political systems. He writes, "Law in the proper sense is right reason in harmony with nature. It is spread through the whole human community, unchanged and eternal, calling people to their duty by its commands and deterring them from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. When it addresses a good man, its commands and prohibitions are never in vain, but those commands and prohibitions have no effect on the wicked. This law cannot be countermanded, nor can it be in any way amended, nor in any way totally rescinded. We cannot be exempted from this law by any degree of the Senate or the people, nor do we need anything else to expound or explain it. In other words, it's self-evident from a deliberation on nature. There will not be one such law in Rome and another in Athens, one now and another in the future, but all peoples at all times will be embraced by a single and eternal and unchangeable law. And there will be, as it were, one Lord and Master of us all, the God who is the author, proposer, and interpreter of that law. Whoever refuses to obey it will be turning his back on himself. Because he has denied his nature as a human being, he will face the gravest penalties of this alone, even if he succeeds in avoiding all the other things that are regarded as punishments." And this is very interesting because this is one of the common threads you can see across antiquity and in the modern era in terms of political theory, is this insistence on the appeal to nature as the ground state from which rights come. Because what he's saying here is that one is denying not God, but denying himself insofar as he's denying the factual state of his presence in the world and what that entails. And of course, the tricky thing, which I think that Cicero just doesn't understand, is the is-ought distinction brought up by Hume. I don't see how an appeal to nature can ever get us an ought statement. Because when I appeal to nature, I see, well, certain things do in fact act in a certain way. They do follow each other in certain respects. But that doesn't tell me that they ought to be as such, or that I ought to mimic them in such a respect. As such, we can see the anthropomorphization of this law into the concept of God. And this is very similar to the way that, for example, God is discussed in the Bible. Think about in Romans 1 when it discusses that God is known to all by his invisible attributes. By the way in which the natural world is constructed, it is self-evident that God exists. Now, if we want to take God meaning what Cicero means here, which is basically just the natural order, well then sure, but I don't know why we have to cloak it in the divine clothing. It seems like we're just using this to provide a normative basis to our laws. But nevertheless, the idea is that this law will be eternal and immutable. But the problem is, and this is always one of the issues in political theory, is it sets a precedent for certain legal conceptions that are immune to criticism or alteration. And this, in some senses, is the foundation for authoritarian political schemes. You cannot question X, Y, and Z because it's a dogma, to put the religious language on it, or an axiom, to use the logical language, of our political order. You simply cannot question it and still maintain the political order as it is. You would be undermining its fundamental principles, such as equal rights, which is grounded in this adherence to natural law. But of course, we can see how this is going to play out in a number of ways, such that law depends upon law-abiding, good people. He writes, "The best men strive for praise and honor, shunning disgrace and dishonor. They're not deterred so much by fear of the penalty prescribed by the law as by a sense of shame, that dread, as it were, of justified rebuke which nature has imparted to man. The statesman develops the sense by making use of public opinion and completes it with the aid of education and social training. And so, in the end, citizens are deterred from crime by moral scruples as much as by fear." So we can see that the grounding thing that's keeping people doing good things is not the fear of the retribution of nature in some material sense, but rather it's the idea that I have perturbed the natural order, that I have gone against what has been ordained for me and to me, and against me, in fact. As a result, we are kept in line by shame. This is a markedly religious way of approaching the law. We are kept in our place by the shame of reproachment of dogma. And this is something that's markedly non-reasoned, right? It's based on moral scruples, as he says, which is quite a shaky foundation, in my opinion. It depends upon the subservience of people to their intuitions. And I think that's important because we can see that what really is the difference between my intuitions and reason? Insofar as I do not know reason except through my intuitions of what is reasonable. If I drop a Coke bottle from a plane to an uncontacted tribe somewhere, this is an entirely senseless thing that I cannot reason about. I cannot make sense of it. Our cultural heritage deeply influences what it means to act reasonably, to find something sensible and rational, right? Think of going to a Muslim country where men are not to shake hands with women, because to encroach upon the body like that, even in such a minute way, is seen as a disruption of her feminine virtue, her modesty, right? As a result, we're seeing that we have this markedly conservative and really just common sense approach to natural law, grounded really in the moral presuppositions of a given people. And as a result, we can see that the appeal to reason is marred by wishful thinking, right? Now, I think it's so interesting to see what Cicero has to say because it bears so much resemblance to the Christian paradigm for thinking about, for example, humans and the imago Dei, the image of God. That humans bear the stamp of the divine image due to their divine kinship. God is the Father, right, in Christianity. Cicero writes, "Since then there is nothing better than reason, and reason is present both in man and God. There's a primordial partnership in reason between man and God. But those who share reason also share right reason. And since that is law, we men must also be thought of as partners with God in law." Very interesting kind of fraternal situation going on here. "Furthermore, those who share law share justice. And those who share all these things must be regarded as belonging to the same state. And much more so if they obey the same powers and authorities." Right? How do we get our political identity? I'm subservient to the same values, the same people, the same authority figures that you are. And they do in fact obey this celestial system, the divine mind and the all-powerful God. Hence, this whole universe must be thought of as a single community shared by gods and men. And this is a total reshaping of man's relationship to nature. For nature is really just the fundament of man's relationship with God. It's an empty vessel to be filled by the Imago Dei as it spreads through the advancement of human reason and society. And as such, we get a markedly Christian understanding of man's relationship to nature, whereby man is not subservient to nature. Now, for Cicero, man is dominant over nature. He writes that nature has lavished such a wealth of things on men for their use and convenience that every growing thing seems to have been given to us on purpose. It does not come into existence by chance. And I don't mean just what shoots forth from the fertile earth, but also domestic animals, for they were obviously created for man's use, or his enjoyment, or his food. Again, countless skills have been discovered thanks to nature's teaching. By copying her, reason has cleverly acquired the necessities of life. And we have this really weird situation where man has reached a certain development in his political circumstances, such that he has the means by which he may subsist, and he thinks, oh, I've been given so much by nature. It's obviously the case that this was meant to be. He literally uses the word obviously created for man's use, which seems like a total, it's just an assertion. It appears to me obvious that nature is subservient to me, just because I happen to have reached a certain position. Regardless of the fact that it's rather arbitrary what is seen as successful in nature. The lion could kill man in an instant, and this doesn't necessarily make the lion inherently more naturally suited to rule over nature, right? It's just, has different natural capacities. So this idea that man is to rule over nature, we can really see how Cicero wants to affirm that this is a testament to rational deliberation, and that this was achieved by rational deliberation, but in fact, it's really just a presupposition. And as such, to discover what it means to be man, which is one of the greatest challenges that has been brought to the fore in modern critical discourse, in, postmodern theory, in postcolonial studies, in feminist theory, in queer studies, etc., is that this notion of man is marred by our presuppositions about who we are and who is similar enough to us. And Cicero takes this to the utmost extreme by saying that humans are essentially the same. He says all of us are like one another. There is no essential difference within mankind. If there were, the same definition would not cover everyone. Reason, in fact, the one thing in which we are superior to the beasts, which enables us to make valid deductions, to argue, refute our opponents, debate, solve problems, draw conclusions, that certainly is commonest to us all. For the same things are grasped by the senses of all, and those things that act on the senses of all alike. And those rudimentary perceptions that are impressed on the mind, the perceptions I mentioned above, are impressed alike on all minds. Speech, which interprets the mind, uses different languages, but expresses the same ideas. Nor is there any member of any nation who cannot attain moral excellence by using nature as his guide. And this has so many problematic assumptions within it. First off, we are beholden to a spectator theory of knowledge, where we have rudimentary perceptions, what Locke would call these kind of bare conceptual sensory stimuli that come from nature. They get impressed upon my senses, and my mind cognizes it, turns it into concepts, things that I can use and think about. So we have unmarred conceptual stimuli and the unmarred world, and the subject, and they are separated by the void and the barred nature of perception. But the problem is that Cicero says the same things are grasped by the senses of all. How do we know that if we only experience the world through our senses? We do not know what the things in themselves are. This is Kant's wariness of the ability to know the Dingen an sich. He says that all those things act on the senses of all alike. How do we know that? How do I know that your perception of any of the colors present on your screen right now is the same as the way that I perceive them? We can't know. All we can do is use language to talk about that, but that still is marred by our own personal subjectivity, right? He wants to say, too, that all these rudimentary perceptions are impressed on all minds the same. That seems totally false. All of us interpret sensory stimuli in vastly different ways, according to, for example, the way that they appear to us existentially. A good example that I like to think about is one that Heidegger brings up, which is that imagine you are walking down a long road. Now, whether this presents itself as an odious, arduous task or a light frolic totally depends upon your existential situation. A long path can feel like a very short path if you're in the right mood, or a very short path can feel like a grueling, arduous journey if you're, for example, tired. This is the same world being perceived through radically different ways, even to the same person. As such, it seems entirely ludicrous to maintain this essential similarity of all humans in their response to nature. Because it basically says that, okay, our essence is the same. We are all identical reproductions of the same essential plan, which is the reasoned, rational animal. And we only differ in, as Cicero says, our habits and opinions. But no, I don't think that, even the most rudimentary biologist can tell you that, okay, we have a lot of things in common, but we also have a lot of things that are fundamentally irreducible to one another. Our genes are fundamentally different from one another, and the most minute differences, such as, for example, trisomy 21, can lead to the most drastic alterations in the way one is birthed and thus the way one interacts with the world. The way one can kind of intersperse themselves through the world via rational deliberation. Not everyone is going to have the same access to that, such as people who are beholden to trisomy 21, right? But this doesn't mean that they're not human, even though they cannot do, as he says, attain moral excellence by using nature as his guide. What if you don't have the rational capacity to do so? What if you're a child, like a newborn, who cannot yet access and deliberate upon the rational nature of the world? You're still a human, right? And of course, we're getting into a whole discussion on the arbitrary nature of the notion of human in the first place. But nevertheless, we must notice, and this is one of the greatest problems of this reason-based approach to political theory, is that Cicero is creating a politics that's grounded in the participation of humans who reject difference. It is the establishment of a universal human nature which grounds political participation, but it is inherently prone to authoritarian imposition on all non-rational beings, right? Think of savages, for example, who are supposedly savages insofar as they lack reason. As such, we must return to the original quote regarding natural and equal rights. If the equalization of wealth is rejected and the equalization of everybody's abilities is impossible, legal rights, at least, must be equal among those who live as fellow citizens in the same state. What do we mean by fellow citizens? What do we mean by fellow state? In many ways, nature itself is the state which is bequeathed to man by God, for Cicero. So could we use that to argue that all all entities have equal rights? Well, no. Cicero would say you need reason, too. How do we know who has reason? We've already talked about the somewhat arbitrary and culturally contingent notion of reason. As such, this is going to lead to, for example, very problematic outcomes in colonialism, where you can justify the imposition of harsh rule and slavery upon other human beings because they don't have reason. Reason being generally a very Eurocentric phenomenon, based largely in the cultural presuppositions of a given people. As such, I think that the Republican laws is a very interesting way to think about and recontextualize modern political theory, especially in the ensuing throes of the election that's coming up. But it should also make us wary of a lot of the founding axioms of Western democracy. That being said, I hope this has been helpful in thinking about these things. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.